Barbara Ash, National Director of the Veteran Institute for Procurement, and I would like to welcome and thank you for joining us for today's VIP webinar, CMMC, Compliance, Audits, and What to Really Expect. Today's webinar is hosted in partnership with Lockheed Martin Corporation and was developed to help veteran businesses accelerate growth in the federal marketplace. Lockheed Martin is committed to the continued education of the suppliers and anyone interested and are working on becoming a Lockheed Martin supplier. Lockheed supports many DoD contracts and feels today's topic is both timely and should be on everyone's mind. Similarly, VIP is all about accelerating the success of veteran-owned small business government contractors, and it is working. On average, companies grow 63% 1 year after graduation from the VIP program, and VIP Grow graduates report 357% growth just 2 years after graduating. VIP offers 3 different curriculums to give veteran-owned small businesses the tools they need to win government contracts. Programs are held in the Washington, D.C. area, just 11 miles from the White House. Participants receive hands-on, market-based instruction that helps establish best business practices for federal government contracting. And the program is offered at no cost. We currently offer VIP Start for veteran-owned small businesses looking to become procurement ready, VIP Grow for later stage companies already selling to the federal government and looking to scale, and VIP International, which accelerates veteran small business success in the global marketplace. This webinar series is made possible thanks to the generous support of SBA and Lockheed Martin Corporation. The slides and audio from today's webinar will be made available on the VIP website at nationalvip.org following today's broadcast. Please submit your questions during today's presentation. We'll have some time at the end of today's webinar to address them, and any questions that we cannot answer live, we will answer after the broadcast and send the answers out to you following today's presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's panelists. Eric Crucius is partner at Holland & Knight. He is an attorney who focuses on a wide range of government contract matters, including bid protests, claims and disputes, compliance issues, and subprime issues. He regularly counsels companies regarding compliance with various cybersecurity regulatory requirements in government contract industry and has extensive experience in government contract litigation, including successfully prosecuting and intervening in numerous bid protests before the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, Government Accountability Office, Board of Contract Appeals, and other federal agencies. Joining Eric is Ed Bassett, CISO at Neosystems. Ed is a senior cybersecurity and risk management subject matter expert with over 32 years of experience in all aspects of security and privacy program architecture design, management, and operations. His experience spans government, healthcare, financial services, and other industries, and includes risk management, program planning, application and software security, security assessments and audits, and security operations. Ed is a U.S. Army veteran and a graduate of Clarkston University, where he earned a degree in computer science. Johan Detweiler is the Director of Operations at Talitech. Johan is the director, as I mentioned, and he specializes in security authorization phases outlined in the NIST SP 837. He excels in the areas of risk management, strategic planning, and problem solving. He specializes in developing solution-based work methodologies that meet a range of deadline and budget requirements and applying NIST, OMB, FISMA, FIPS, and other federal regulations and requirements associated with information security. This is an outstanding panel of expertise. I know you are in excellent hands, and with that, it is now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to our panelists, beginning with Eric Crucius.
Hi, and thank you for the wonderful introduction. I really appreciate being here. we all spoke among ourselves, and we'd be silly if we didn't acknowledge that there are other news stories going on. But before we do that, so because of that, I wanted to kind of say a few words on the coronavirus and what government contractors should do to prepare. There's no slides on this, but we'll hit our first polling question in about 2 minutes after that. But just some things to think about as a government contractor in this uncertain time. You may have trouble getting services and supplies through your supply chain. And if that happens, there are what they call force majeure clauses in government contracts and also often in contracts between primes and subs that excuse delay in a pandemic situation or a quarantine situation. So refer back to your contracts and see what you're able to do and not able to do. If if you're unable to supply something to the government or to a prime contractor, you do have an excuse for the delay. It won't stop necessarily those parties from going out and finding the product or service elsewhere, but you shouldn't be terminated for default. But that's very contingent on the clauses that you have in your contracts. This is similar to a government shutdown in some respects, where government personnel or government work sites will be unavailable. So think about the implications of that. Perhaps you have a contract that requires some work on site and some work not on site. Maybe hold that work that's not on site for a rainy day coming possibly very soon, if you can. And there may be options for the government not to pay a contractor if they're not performing, through no fault of their own, but they're not performing. So see what your contract says about payment obligations that the prime or government has towards you, the subcontractor or prime contractor. Subcontracts between primes and subs are commercial contracts at their heart. So those will be interpreted through a commercial contract lens, even if they have FAR and DFARS clauses in them or other agency clauses in them. So just a few quick tips. Take inventory of your contracts, draft some kind of action plan if you're impacted by the coronavirus, document all start up and wind down costs if there is a temporary stop work order or something like that. Decide which employees will be impacted by a work site closing and what that means for them, and how to maybe you could reassign them for training and things like that if there is a work site closure. And of course, document everything, mitigate your costs, and seek recovery for those costs if you're allowed to under your contract. Also, if you're a manufacturer of any kind, there's something called the Defense Production Act, where the government is able to prioritize their goods, especially manufacturing, over other contractual obligations a prime contractor must have. So see if your contract has a rating under the Defense Production Act. So with that, we'll turn back to the task at hand, but I wanted to give a quick overview on coronavirus because I know there's probably a lot of people thinking about that. To our first polling question for what do you know? And the first polling question up here is, what CMMC level are you targeting initially? And select the top level that you would be seeking. So it's 1 through 5 are the possible levels, of course. And can we get a tally of that, or is that for later?
Sure. So right now we have 37% at 3. Actually 38%. We have 27% at 2 and 27% at 1. Now 3 is up to 40%.
Oh, and then we have 6% at level 5, which is significant, really, because that's the highest level.
Yeah. And that's not surprising. I know Ed and Johan will talk a little bit more about this, but it seems like most people are aiming for 3. And there are some folks that are aiming for higher or lower levels, but 3 seems to be the sweet spot for most contractors, at least as of right now. So why don't we go to the next slide? That's great information. So who are we and why are we here? What's going on? How come we need CMMC? What has got us here? This is a slide that's actually like 20 slides put together, and I created this little chart. This is about the farthest I can go with my Word and PowerPoint skills. And there's the stats right there. That's good to see. But we have various actors coming after us from a cybersecurity standpoint, trying to infect our systems, get information from us. The top left is, you can see North Korea. There's Kim Jong-un looking over a probably pretty scared soldier using a computer. You have various folks who are part of Anonymous there. You have Russia, which is a major actor in this area. Like I said, Anonymous. WikiLeaks, of course. The picture that towards the middle, towards the bottom, is the Chinese military. They have a separate unit division that deals with just cyber espionage and things like that. So they're all coming for you or for us, and they use various different methods of doing so. So the couple I want to point out here: phishing. That's when you get kind of that email, like click on this link, or you have cash that's owed to you. You click on this link to claim it, or your account's been compromised, like a fake account compromise. Click on this link to put in your password and put in some information. Very easy to kind of get fooled by stuff like that. And then you have spear phishing, which is kind of that, but more specific to an organization or a small group of people, or even to an individual. And then there's whaling, which is to the just left and bottom of that, and that's kind of the same thing, but they chase after C-level suite folks. So phishing, spear phishing, and whaling are all kind of different flavors of the same thing. Insiders, I want to bring your attention to that one. That's on the right side, about 2 boxes down. And the insider folks, those are the most dangerous folks. And some insiders are not intentional. They just click on a link by mistake because they get it, and all of a sudden there's an infection in the system. But of course, there are the insiders that are committing espionage. Edward Snowden is the most famous, of course. He was an insider. And you don't have to be a genius to compromise a system if you're an insider, because the hardest thing to do is to get into a system, right? And the insiders have already accomplished that because you have given them permission to be there. And that's no fault of your own, of course, because you have to give permission to folks to use your system if you want your business to function. So the insider threat is a real one, and mitigation strategies against that include some things that CMMC will require, including password hygiene, giving only access that's necessary for their job, different things like that. And then of course you have terrorists and who are out there. They haven't really utilized cyber espionage yet, but that's probably not too far off in our future. The most interesting one, I think, even though it's probably not very common, is war driving, and that's where folks literally drive through a neighborhood and try to break into Wi-Fi networks that are not secured, or they might do it in an apartment building or office building or things like that. So that's kind of setting the stage of where we are. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about a little bit more about this. The first 2 bullet points kind of cover what we already chatted about. The third bullet point talked about is really kind of connected to this, but not directly, and it's the supply chain issue, that if you get goods or services or have Chinese or Russian goods or products, especially with the named companies in this bullet point, you may have to realign your supply chain. But then there's also the Federal Acquisition Security Council. If the government now thinks that your supply chain, including cybersecurity, is inadequate, they have the power to debar contractors under that, although that hasn't been fully stood up yet. And of course, DoD has enacted regulations for cyber requirements, and the FAR Council is not far behind with some new regulations coming up. Let's go to the next slide. So I feel like I'm full of good news today. I apologize. So these are the DFARS clauses that are out there that are the most stringent, and then the bottom one is the FAR clause. And then I just have them up here to do a very quick review to see how we got to CMMC. So the DFARS clause that you may be familiar with if you do business with DoD is the -7012. And the most important thing is that middle point, actually, which is an implementation of NIST 800-171, which is required upon award of the contract, and that contains about 110 security controls that contractors must adopt. Right now, it's a self-certification, essentially, but with the exception of the system security plan that's required under that. But what CMMC is essentially doing is turning that into a third-party certification, and the different levels have different requirements. So level 3 is pretty similar to 800-171 with a few more requirements on it. Level 1 and 2 is something less than 800-171, and levels 4 and 5 will be something more than 800-171. But this clause itself, before CMMC, and it'll stand alongside CMMC because it has some other requirements. For instance, reporting cyber incidents within 72 hours, having it flow down. You have to also support an investigation by DoD if there is a reported cyber breach, and also preserve malware that you receive and send it to the DoD Cybersecurity Center. So there's a few different other requirements in there. The Dash 7007, 8, and 9 are just kind of different flavors of supply chain and cybersecurity requirements. They're more at the margins, but I have them there for your information. And then below that is the FAR clause, FAR 52204-21, which is the basic safeguarding of covered commercial contractor information systems. And this is really just a very basic, about 15 or so requirements that every contractor should be doing anyway. And you'll find that just about in every FAR clause that's not for cost items. So commercial products and services, small businesses, all included in that FAR clause. So if you don't have any DoD contracts right now and just civilian contracts, still look at that clause to confirm that you're doing those things. But you know, it's something to just be aware of. There is another FAR clause coming down the pike that will be more specific and more stringent, more in line with the DFARS clause we expect, and we expect that to come out at some point this year. And then there's agency-specific requirements. These are different agencies have their own requirements that are possibly more stringent than the DFARS even or the FAR clause. So if you do have a contract or potential contract with an agency, read it carefully, the solicitation and the contract, to see what you're signing up for. Sometimes things are buried in documents that cannot be found. For instance, the IRS has a 1-hour turnaround to report a cyber incident in a lot of their contracts. Let's go to the next slide. So that all leads us to CMMC. The government really believed that contractors were not complying with 800-171. So they want a way to kind of verify that. And whereas the DFARS clause only is applicable if you have COI, controlled unclassified information, CMMC is for all contractors, as it says in that bullet list, whether you have COI or not. So it's going to be applicable to small businesses, subcontractors, commercial contractors. It's going to be applicable if you want to do business with DoD, whether directly as a prime contractor or indirectly as a subcontractor, you're going to need to have a CMMC certification. Now, that being said, there'll be some contractors who only will require a level 1, which is pretty basic to have, because you know, you're cleaning an army base or something like that. You're not possessing any kind of information that the DoD finds to be high priority. So it builds upon this 7012 and 800-171. And like I said before, the DFARS clause will be a separate obligation as we come along. Let's go to the next slide. So this is the schedule where we were. CMMC model was developed in stages. They had a 0.4, 0.6, 0.7. They released the final version, the final for now version, 1.0, at the end of January. And RFIs containing this requirement are going to be are scheduled to be issued in June of this year, and RFPs scheduled to be issued in September. Initially, it's thought that, and we'll go to the next slide. Initially, it's thought that it would be all RFIs and RFPs, but what they're going to do is kind of do a test, Pathfinder test for some of them. So this is the schedule from DoD. You can see there's a lot of moving parts here. You can see about 4 lines down, there's something called Pathfinder. And that is kind of, they're going to determine which DoD contracts they want to work on first to have the CMMC requirement. And they're going to try to get those folks certified who are bidding on those contracts or seek to bid on those contracts. So staying engaged with the agency, with DoD and potential customers is important, so they know that you're out there and that you'll want to be certified as one of the first waves so you can bid on these contracts. And you can see this training that's going on, and a lot of things moving parts that have to happen with the accreditation body, which we're going to talk about here on the next slide. They're involved as well, standing up. So the accreditation body is coming together, and what their role is going to be is they're going to not be part of the government. They're going to have sign an MOU with the government, which I understand has not happened yet as of a few days ago. And what their role is going to be is they're going to issue the certifications themselves. They're going to train the trainers, train the assessors who are coming around and assessing companies, and then also be a spot where if there's a dispute about an assessment, they can resolve that dispute. So, and they'll collect their fees from the from the auditors and the assessors will get their fees from the third parties that they're auditing. So the third party government contractor will pay the auditor will split part of that fee to the assessment body, accreditation body. So they are taking shape. They're doing a lot of work in a short amount of time. They're developing training, and they have these working groups that are working on all different things within the organization itself. They appoint to the board that's functioning right now. They're looking for office space. They are a nonprofit entity, though, not connected directly with the government. Let's go to the next slide. So a few things before I pass it off, 2 more slides before I pass it off to Ed, I believe. And one thing is we know that certification is going to be through 5 different levels. Auditors who want to utilize level 4 and 5 or want to audit companies for level 4 and 5 will most undoubtedly require additional training, so that the training for level 1 through 3 will be separate and apart. It sounds like from levels 4 and 5. Certifications will not be required for you to bid on a contract, even as CMMC is a requirement for that contract. The certification will be required upon award. So you can endeavor to be certified while you put in your proposal. You will not be awarded the contract, though, if you're not certified by the time the government's ready to make an award. So, you have a little bit of a reprieve there to kind of get things in line. The RFP will contain the certification level that's required, levels 1 through 5. Really important to kind of look at that and see if that's something you're doing right now. So, you're performing, presumably a lot of you are performing some work for DoD. What level do you think is appropriate for the work you're doing? And that's the level you think, you should definitely try to achieve. Otherwise, you could have a problem in winning this work when it comes up for bid again. And I'll say this, there is some concern that DoD may attach a level to something that's too high for the work. It could be a couple reasons for that. One reason could be that, the contracting officer is very cautious and doesn't want a cyber breach. And if the level is too low, and there's a cyber breach, they could be blamed for assigning too low a level, so it may be based on that. Or perhaps the DoD agency wants to limit competition, and their favorite contractor is a level 4, so they make the RFP a level 4. You do have rights in that instance. You could file a pre-award protest, of course, to challenge that. But you should kind of keep an eye and kind of calibrate where you want to go based on the work you're doing now, because the first priority is re-winning the work you already have before expanding other work. And of course, this will have to be flowed down to subcontractors. It's not entirely clear whether the same level has to be flowed down. For instance, if it's a level 3 contract and you're going to be doing as a prime contractor level 3 work, then maybe you'll have a sub that's not doing level 3 work, and it could be level 1 work. Who decides what level that subcontractor needs to be? Is it the prime contractor or is it the government? That hasn't been decided yet. But hundreds of thousands of contractors will need to be certified fast. So, we're coming up to a spot now where this is all going to have to move very quickly in order for this to work in the way that DoD wants to. Let's go to the next slide. I will say, though, that DoD is rolling this out over a 5-year time frame, so not every contractor will have to be certified. But of course, if you're in the business of trying to sell things to DoD, you want to be one of the ones who's certified, of course, because it's the competitive advantage, and an RFP may come out that you're interested in responding to, and if it has a CMMC certification in there, then you're kind of out of luck. So that whole prioritization is kind of up in the air right now. We don't know where that's going to play out. Some intended and maybe unintended consequences. Some companies, especially the non-traditional contractors, may be driven away from doing business with the government. And this bucks a trend of what we've seen with government trying to ease regulations to attract more commercial businesses. And then, of course, we could see a change and possibly even a decrease in cybersecurity cases, Cybersecurity False Claims Act cases, because really a lot of times those cases are based on a government contractor kind of giving advice, speaking with the government in a way that's kind of misleading. And here you're going to have a certification, and it's a go, no go, essentially. So that's going to possibly decrease cybersecurity related False Claims Act cases. Although, on the other hand, if the company is not fully open with the auditor or assessor, that could give rise to claims based on that. And with that, I'm going to pass it off, I believe, to Ed to pick up the presentation from here.
Thanks, Eric. So while Eric's been spending his time looking at the regulatory aspects of this and the mechanics of the CMMC program, I've been spending my days looking at the technical requirements. What are the things that CMMC asks us to do as contractors? Because my job is to design and operate successful security programs that are going to pass this audit. So today I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the lingo in CMMC, and then look at the different levels and what's required there. And then I'll wrap up with some discussion about steps you can take to prepare now. This is new, it's brand new, so that people are looking at this really for the first time and trying to decide what are their first steps. Let's go to the next slide. So we're going to start with a quick polling question, just to get an idea of what you view as your biggest challenges to CMMC success. So based on what you know already, and as you've seen CMMC in the news, maybe looked at the drafts that have come out over the summer, what are you viewing as your biggest challenges? So we'll take a quick pause while people vote, and then we'll show the results on the screen. All right, hopefully everyone's had a chance to vote. Amy, Barbara, do you have some results you can show?
percent say that confusing requirements. 14% again says requires expensive technology to comply. Then next is 31% under what? Under what?
Unclear.
Oh, unclear what is covered and what is not. And 36% said there's no one to do everything, skills, staffing, so forth. And 6% are unsure how to convince the auditor of all items.
Very good. Well, just leave that on the screen for 1 second, if you don't mind.
Yep.
What the top one, confusing requirements, I will say that that's been a big issue with the NIST 800-171 standard that's been in effect for the last 2.5-3 years. There is quite a bit of explanation in the CMMC standard about what the expectation of the government is. So the government has gone a long way in trying to clarify what they want people to do. I think there's still some confusion in the marketplace around how expensive is this? How hard is this? What kind of skills do you need? I'll try to clarify some of that today in the short time we have, but that's something that we probably need to, all of us probably need to dig a little deeper in thinking about that as we try to figure out how to meet these requirements. Let's go to the next slide. So what's new in CMMC? What is the big new thing? Eric mentioned one. He mentioned there's going to be an independent audit. There's going to be a requirement for independent audit. But the other thing that's new and really interesting is the M in the acronym. So one of the M stands for model, which is not very interesting, but the other one stands for maturity, which is new and quite interesting. So this is the first time that the government has tried to measure the level of maturity of implementation, the amount of implementation that's occurring within the defense industrial base. So where we had NIST 800-171 had to do all those items, and we saw that really as a checklist. If you did all the things and you asserted that you did all the things, then you got to pass. And so there was a lot of emphasis on filling technical gaps. With CMMC, that's still the case, but the government has made it very clear this is not just a checklist. They're looking to see that we've really embraced these things from an institutional perspective and made them part of the fabric of how we run our businesses. So that's what the maturity piece is about. There's some specific things that auditors are going to look for. I'll talk a little bit about that, and then the speaker beyond me, Johan, talking from the assessor perspective, will give a little more flavor on that. Let's go to the next slide. So the things I'm going to talk about today are from version 1.0. As Eric mentioned, this was released in the end of January. This is final in the sense that this is guidance I think we can all build to. Where we saw earlier drafts, there have been significant changes from those early drafts. There was a lot of feedback from industry and maybe other parts of government, but the industry feedback was listened to. And there's been a lot of improvements as we've seen this evolve. What we see now is a really workable standard. It's published on the website. The link is on the screen, and if you get the slides after, you can go find that pretty readily. It's a very workable document. It includes, as I mentioned, a lot more clarity around the requirements than what we saw in the NIST 800-171. It's got the standard, but it also has an explanation. It also has some real-world examples of what's expected for each of the requirements within there. Let's go to the next slide. So I'll start with breaking down the lingo. CMMC has a model, a framework within it that talks about domains, processes, practices, capabilities, as you can see on the screen. The two things that matter most are practices and processes. So let's break those down a little bit. The practices are those technical activities, the specific cybersecurity controls you have to put in place. This is the piece that's very equivalent to what we saw with the previous standard NIST 800-171. They've taken that and supplemented it with some new requirements that have come from both US and foreign. They've actually tried to do a best practice look at this. It covers everything that is in the previous NIST standard, and then they've added some things on, and I'll describe how those lay out in a minute. And then the second piece is the processes. So these are procedural activities. These are things you do to demonstrate maturity, how well you've institutionalized the practices. And again, I'll have a slide where I'll talk a little bit about what those specific things are that the auditors will look for. So practices and processes are the two things that you need to pass the audit. Both have to be in place. Both are going to be assessed in the certification process. Let's go to the next slide. So Eric made reference to the fact that there's 5 levels. The concept of these 5 levels is that the government wants to spend their money where that money is needed. So if a company is working on non-sensitive types of work, not dealing with any sensitive information, they just need level 1, a basic sense of cyber hygiene. But as you progress in the level of sensitivity and the criticality of the work you're doing for the DoD, there's an expectation of higher maturity. The government has said that they expect that in numbers terms, most people are going to be at that level 1, right? Most people are not doing sensitive work, but there's 300 to 350,000 people or companies within the defense industrial base. So even if the majority are in level 1, there's a lot others in those higher levels. The levels build upon themselves cumulatively. So in level 1, basic cyber hygiene is just 17 things that you need to do. These are all very basic technical items and are equivalent to what you see in the FAR clause that Eric mentioned, which is for protection of federal contract information. So again, something that's fairly easy to achieve for almost all companies. As you move up, level 2 is designed as a stepping stone, if you will, for companies that may need to get to level 3. The government has said that they're not going to have few if any contracts will be led at the level 2. It's got 72 practices, so there's a pretty good technical jump there, and that you need in order to process controlled unclassified information. So that makes level 2 an interesting level for companies that are in progress, but again, not something that's probably a goal in and of itself. Level 3, I think, is what most people said in the polling question at the beginning that they're shooting for. Level 3, labeled as good cyber hygiene, has 130 practices required. So it has all of the requirements from NIST 800-171. So everything that, if you're working under the DFARS clause, you're processing controlled unclassified information today, you've already had to attest that you've met 110 of the 130 things. So they have added 20 new things. I've got a slide later that lists all 20 of those, so you can see kind of what's new, but it's intended to be essentially equivalent to what we're seeing today for contractors that must comply with 171. And then levels 4 and 5 up the ante. So these are with sensitive information. There's the idea here that they're going to be subject to advanced persistent threats. These are state-sponsored actors that are basically coming for as they do this work. They need to have a security program that adapts to that threat and is reactive to that threat in real time. So there's an increased technical sophistication, increased level of maturity that's expected from those companies. DoD has said that levels 4 and 5 is going to be a small percentage of the defense industrial base. Certainly the large contractors, the large prime contractors already have very robust cybersecurity programs in place, probably already meet level 4 and 5. Smaller level of security already baked in at that level. Let's go to the next slide. The maturity piece, I mentioned the processes, what's expected at the different levels. At the first level, level 1, there's no emphasis on maturity in the sense that the auditor is not going to look for any specific artifacts. They just want to see that you perform the necessary practices. So no special requirements there. At level 2, it needs to be documented with policies and standard operating procedures. At level 3, it adds the requirement to have plans in place where you demonstrate that you've assigned responsibility, that you've applied the proper resources to make sure that the policies and procedures are actually being followed. As you move to level 4, there's an emphasis on looking at effectiveness, reviewing for effectiveness. Are these things actually working and stopping the threat at level 4? And then at level 5, a look towards optimization. Are you doing the things necessary to learn lessons as you have experience with incidents, as the threat changes? Are you adapting that and doing that in a consistent way across your entire organization? This is a big leap for a lot of companies. So I think if you look especially at small and mid-sized defense contractors, even those who have good security in place from a technical perspective, they don't have a need typically, especially small businesses, for a lot of process maturity. They tend to work off word of mouth, ad hoc procedures, and those things are very effective for small businesses. But under CMMC, there's going to be a necessity to get that written down on paper, make sure that they're being followed, and being able to demonstrate that with artifacts that you show to the auditor. So that's definitely new requirement that we haven't seen previously. Let's go to the next slide. So what's new? This is a little bit of an eye chart. There's 20 things I mentioned at level 3 that are new and different than what we saw before at 800-171. And as we get to levels 4 and 5, there's yet some additional things, which I've not detailed, because I think that only is a small percentage of this audience. But I think a lot of this audience indicated they're looking at level 3. So that means these are 20 things you probably haven't considered before. Some of them are things that you already have in place for other reasons, even though you may have not been required to do it. So backups, for example. I think everybody backs up their data. That was not an emphasis within NIST 800-171 because it focused on confidentiality of government data. But under CMMC, there's a requirement to back up, test those backups, et cetera. But there's some other things in here that are new, probably not doing already by default. Collecting audit log information in a centralized repository, reviewing that audit log, detecting and reporting events, analyzing and triage events. So this is around understanding what's going on in your systems and reacting to that. There's not a requirement for real-time response or fast response. That comes at the higher levels. But at level 3, they're looking for still, a response to things that might indicate an intrusion. Sort of basic protection of your systems, web content filtering, where are people going, what websites are they going to, making sure they're not going to places that might host malicious software, email protections, that sort of thing. Keeping track of threats and knowing what's going on. Again, proactive threat hunting comes at the higher levels, but at level 3, there's an expectation that you're following the notices being put out by the government and other sources and taking some response to those things. Let's go to the next slide. So what's the best things to do to prepare? Again, this is a brand new certification. There's nobody out there doing assessments. As Eric mentioned, they're still getting the process together, the accreditation board, understanding who the assessors are. So you can't go out and get a CMMC certification today. It's not possible, but you can do a lot of things to prepare. So let's talk real quickly about what are those first moves and why you should be doing those now and not waiting until later. Let's go to the next slide. The first one is to take some time to think about scope and segmentation. CMMC is issued at the company level. So previous things, NIST 171 was all about sort of system specific. If you're a small company where you've got sort of one IT footprint for the entire company, then those things may be one and the same. But as your company grows and becomes more complex, you've got to think about what are the pieces that of my company that are involved with defense work, a business that maybe don't need to be in the CMMC scope. To keep the cost under control, it's important to make sure that only the places of your business where there's actual controlled unclassified information, do you spend the money to provide that level of protection. It's certainly okay to provide it everywhere, but if you're trying to keep costs under control, it may be necessary to scope the CMMC certification and segment that. If you've got a complex organization that has a parent company, maybe providing shared services to smaller subordinate companies, which is common in certain parts of the 8A community, then that can be another thing to think about. The guidance we see in the CMMC is just a very brief sentence that says contractors will choose their own scope and segment their systems as they see appropriate. There's not a lot of detail about how to do that. I think when we see the assessment guidance come out from the accreditation board, we may have a little more knowledge there. But now is a good time to think about how are you going to segment your IT systems, and how are you going to keep track of where that sensitive data is and what pieces are in scope. Second is to understand where your gaps are. I would suggest that if you're looking at a gap assessment, you're going to look at both the technical piece and some of the maturity piece, the policies, procedures, plans. I think it's important to look at those maturity gaps first. Reason being that that's something that a lot of companies may not have in place. Even if they've already been doing NIST 800-171, they probably don't have the documentation the way it needs to be, because these are new requirements in CMMC. And second, when an auditor is looking at policies, procedures, and plans, they want to see that you're following it. So if you just published it the day before the assessor got there, there's no track record. There's no evidence that you've ever done any of the things in these brand new policies. So getting them in place early so that you can show a track record of following and complying with them and all the evidence that generates, very important. And then after that, I would say focus on getting technical solutions that fill those practice gaps. There's some expense involved here, and there's he's saying, hey, this is expensive, especially for small businesses. And the government's reaction has been, if you are already under the DFAR 7012 and you've already self-attested that you're meeting NIST 800-171, you've already done 110 of the 130 things it takes to be level 3. Tell me again why that's so expensive and difficult for you. So there's some pushback in both directions. And I think the expectation is that although there may be some gaps, the gaps should be minor at the time you go for certification. Some things in your plan of action and milestone, but you should have technical solutions identified for all of the controls at the level that you select. Let's go to the next slide. I think it's important to look at who you're partnering with and what they bring to the table with respect to CMMC compliance. If you're trying to achieve any level above level 1, as I saw in the earlier slides, there's a large number of technical controls that are in place. Each of these technical controls has to be done in a way that's compliant. So if you're getting services from managed service partner, from technology vendors, and those services are not designed to meet CMMC, you may find yourself with a solution that is close but not quite matching the requirements there. So I think it's important to evaluate those technology partners and your service provider partners, see what their commitment is to meeting CMMC requirements. Are they familiar? Have they aligned their service offerings with these requirements? They're new, so everyone in the marketplace is potentially having to make adjustments to make sure they've met CMMC. Some technologies and service providers are out in front. Others are just now learning what CMMC means. Last thing I'll mention is to take advantage of cloud services. This is a good way to shift some of the compliance burden. So people are already moving to the cloud for all portions of their IT infrastructure for many reasons around flexibility and cost and accessibility, et cetera. But security is a piece of this. So if you've got cloud services that meet the government's FedRAMP requirements that have been published, you can be sure that those are above and beyond what CMMC is requiring, and that allows you to shift a good piece of the compliance burden for managing that IT footprint. Let's go to the next slide. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Johan, who's going to talk about this from the assessor perspective, as you try to think about what is the process you're going to have to go to obtain the certification.
Hey, thank you, Ed. I really appreciate that. That's a perfect segue into this. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Johan Detweiler. As Ed alluded to earlier, my specialty is kind of on the assessment side of things. And, once you get everything in place, what do you have to do to show it's in place and actually get a certification? So we're going to walk through that real quick here. Next slide, please. All right, so the big difference that CMMC is introducing is the whole idea of self-attestation versus outside assessment. And the thing that you need to realize is that when we come in as assessors, independent assessors, you need to be able to demonstrate that you have in fact put these practices and processes in place. And that means there has to be documented evidence. That means you have to have personnel that can actually speak to what they do. If you have a process in place, but your system administrators don't know that process exists, well, then we can't really say that that process is in place. We have to be able to see the documentation, know that people are using it, and then also look at some of the evidence that's created through those processes so that you can demonstrate that it's in place. So that's really the big major difference here. And as Ed stated, right now there is no one out there that has been accredited to do a CMMC audit yet. So just keep that in mind. That process is coming down the pike, and you know, we're definitely monitoring that and trying to be ahead of the crowd. So we'll keep an eye on that. Next slide, please. All right, so when you're going through security audits, they're very, very methodical, they're meticulous, they're detailed. There are a list of requirements. So in the case of a CMMC level 3 assessment, there are 130 practices that you have to do. When we go through the audit, we're going to go through each of those practices. Right now, the document that we sort of utilize based on 800-171 is NIST 800-171A, which is basically a guideline for assessors to look at the 110 requirements of 171 and determine if they're implemented. That's a great document to take a look at and understand if you can actually show that you're meeting the requirements of 800-171. And once the CMMC process gets a little bit mature, they're going to have a similar document. And that document will tell you exactly what you need to do to show that each of those 130 practices at level 3 is implemented. So just understand that we're going to come in and we're going to be very detailed in what we're doing. The other thing is for level 1, CMMC states that you don't need to have any processes documented. But I just want everyone to be clear that sometimes it's actually easier to document things. If you have an account review process that happens quarterly, if you don't document it, it's very difficult to actually execute that process on a quarterly basis. You know, sometimes somebody leaves and you don't know who's going to take over the process, or everyone has a different way of doing it. So creating documentation can actually be beneficial, even though it's not strictly required by level 1. Next slide, please. So preparing for the audit. So again, level 3 is NIST 800-171 verbatim, plus an additional 20 requirements and 3 processes. So every organization really needs to stop and think about what level they should be going to. And I can go ahead and tell you, if you're currently processing CUI and you currently have a requirement to meet NIST 800-171, I would definitely recommend shooting for a level 3. Level 1 and level 2 do not include all of the requirements of NIST 800-171. So if you're already doing it, I would just go ahead and focus on that level 3. Take the additional steps to go ahead and implement the additional practices and start getting to where you need to be. One of the first things that you can be doing right now is conducting a gap analysis against NIST 800-171. Like I said, 800-171A is a document that exists that you can do your own assessment. There's also a handbook, the NIST Handbook 162, which is a guide to performing your own self-assessment. So if you're not quite ready to bring in an independent auditor, but you want to go ahead and start doing the self-assessment process, go ahead and assess yourself against 800-171. That will give you a lot of advantages. You'll actually, have an assessment process in place, and you'll get used to gathering artifacts and realizing, can I really demonstrate that these requirements are in place? Can I actually show what needs to be shown? So it's a good process to go through. And as Ed alluded to, if you're struggling with this, reach out to partners, groups like Neosystem, Holland and Knight, Talatech. This is what we specialize in, so we can help you kind of go through that process and establish, self-assessments, or, create the documentation and help you put some of the requirements in place. Next slide, please. So, I'm an auditor, and I'm kind of used to being the least liked person in the room. No one likes to see the auditor come in. It's a lot of paperwork. They're here to just basically tell you what you've done wrong over the past year or however long, and that's it. But I can say that we can be helpful. Because we're auditors, we have to become very, very familiar with the certification programs that we work with. And we also have to establish how it is that companies can actually demonstrate these things in the real world. Sometimes things are documented in government documents that maybe aren't very clearly worded or thought through, and we have a lot of experience with this, and we've seen real world implementations, so we can kind of translate the standards and the frameworks and help you to understand what it is that a specific requirement is looking for, and how you might be able to implement it. And then we're also specialized in doing gap analysis, so we come in and we look at where you are currently and where you need to be to get to any type of level you're looking at. And that can help you come from the ground up if you've got nothing, going from a level 3 to a level 4, or if you have another certification, if you're FedRAMP or you have a NIST 853 ATO, you can use that information to document your CMMC/800-171 preparedness. Next slide, please. The other thing to think about is that there will be the process of identifying gaps and then fixing those gaps. There is never a perfect audit. You will always have something that you're not doing, something that your organization could do better. And that's part of the process. Having a plan of action and milestones and knowing that you can address requirements in a systematic manner is all part of the process. So understand that, yes, while it's annoying to do a self-assessment and say, we have a lot of things we need to fix, that puts you on the roadmap for becoming certified and being able to demonstrate what you need to do. So don't look at it as a negative thing. Look at the gap analysis and the POAM as just part of the process. I will say there is a statement in the CMMC version 1 that does say that they will not accept any company that is not meeting the requirements. You have to meet all of the requirements 100% in order to get to the level that you're certifying to. Well, I think they'll probably need to release a little bit of clarity on that statement, because every framework has this POAM process and the ability to say, we've gone through the analysis, we've identified gaps, however, we still feel that this is a fairly secure system and organization, and if they address these gaps in a timely manner, they will become even more secure. So I just want everyone to be aware, while that statement exists, I think they'll probably have to walk back or at least explain that language a little bit. So having a POAM and identifying gaps is definitely something you should be doing and something you should not be afraid of. Next slide, please. So just wanted to point out some of the pitfalls. I'm sure everyone kind of is aware of this. The phased rollout, a 5-year period, there are 350,000 vendors. And at the end of that 5 years, so in fiscal year 26, all new contracts will contain a CMMC requirement. That's a really intensive timeline, especially considering that there are no accreditors or certifiers out there right now. As a good example, the FedRAMP program is a very comparable program, and it's been around for actually about 12 years. It currently has about 170 accreditations. So as you can see, if the CMMC program kind of goes along that same line, they're going to have a lot of issues getting all of these accreditations done. So they need to be aware of that, and I think they are aware of that. It's just working out the details of how they're going to make it a little bit of a quicker certification process. The other thing that Ed spoke about and is just so important to understand is the idea of boundaries. So CMMC has been discussed as being an organizational certification. However, if you look at the actual requirements, so many of the requirements are system specific. If you think about the identification and authentication family, those controls are purely system specific. They are not organizational at all. So really understanding where in my organization do systems process, transmit, or store CUI, and can I make that an enclave and only worry about the CMMC certification for that enclave? It's really important to understand that principle and then to execute it when you actually start building out design documentation. Next slide, please. All right, so just a few assumptions. I know everyone is really concerned about costs of certifications, and unfortunately, there's just not a whole lot that we can say about it yet, because we don't know at what level of depth and scope they're going to be expecting these audits to take place. So the only thing that I can definitely say is that the cost of an audit will most likely be based on the level of certification. So a level 1 audit will obviously be less than level 2 and so forth. So I mean, we can definitely base that just on the fact that there's less practices in each level. So obviously that should allow for a quicker audit as well as a less intensive audit. There's also going to be some requirement to maintain your certification. This could be annual assessments, maybe an assessment every 3 years, but the cost of certification will not be a one-time cost. Level 3, I know there's been a lot of talk. I know Katie Arrington from the DoD has said that level 1 is going to be one of the more popular levels. However, all I can say is that currently we know 800-171 is required in the DFARS if you process, transmit, or store CUI. Level 1 or 800-171 is of course equivalent to level 3, as we've mentioned. I seem to think that level 3 is probably going to be one of the more likely requested levels that you're going to see in RFP vehicles. The other thing to think is that this project is really starting because 800-171 self-attestation was not really working out, which does mean that there's probably going to be a fair amount of oversight over CMMC. So I definitely recommend trying to get your certifications as soon as possible, because when frameworks and certification programs are around, they tend to get more and more complicated as the longer that they're around. So if you can get through the certification process quickly, as you know, in the first year or so, you might be able to avoid some of those complexities developing and hopefully just get your certification and then just have to maintain it. Next slide, please. Okay, so right now, what should you be doing? Conduct an 800-171 gap analysis. There's nothing that you can do for CMMC directly until more guidance is released, but you have all of the tools that you need to conduct a gap analysis. The NIST SP 800-171 handbook exists. You can read through that and it will show you. If you do a gap analysis, you will have an idea of 85% of the level 3 requirements. So you will know if you are on a good path to being able to meet a level 3 certification when it's needed. So I really highly recommend going through this process. And the process will also allow you to familiarize yourself with the process of doing assessments and creating artifacts and showing documentation. So it's just a really good way to make sure that you're ready when CMMC hits the streets. Next slide, please. All right, next polling question. All right, and I know it's. I hope we were able to hopefully take away a little bit of the fear and shed some light on these topics. Amy, I think we can pass it on to you.
Well, the poll is in progress, and but I did want to share with you, there is a question that came up, and Johan, I think you could answer this. My sense, I mean, I'm pretty certain now the NIST 800-171 is no longer going to be a requirement. It is now going to be the CMMC. So there is no certification for NIST 800-171. It is now the CMC.
Well, so currently, as of today, 800-171 is still the law of the land. So until CMMC is officially released and we start seeing it in the RFIs and the contract vehicles, right now, 800-171 is what you should still be gauging yourself against, still conducting your self-assessments, still going through that process. CMMC should fully come into place by the end of this year. We should start seeing certifications. However, until it's fully rolled out, there's going to be a little bit of overlap because if you're not seeing a certification requirement in an RFP, it's most likely still going to be 800 and 171 that you're going to have to meet. So it's going to be a little bit of overlap until everything's fully laid out. So don't think that 800 171 is not still important. In fact, they actually just published revision 2 of 800 171. It just came out a few weeks ago. None of the requirements changed. It's mostly just editorial corrections and some introductory information, but all of the requirements stayed the same.
And so the follow-up to that question was, who can you reach out to in order to get this security control? If you're not at NIST 800-171, I think you referenced it in your talking points. Certainly, anybody on this panel can be a resource for not only NIST 800 but CMMC. Is that correct?
That's correct. Absolutely. So we'll be able to help you kind of get that gap. So 800 171 right now, those are services that assessment groups and everyone on this call, that's something that we offer. And we are starting to put in place that little bridge analysis where we can look at those additional 20 requirements, or if you're going for a level 4 and 5, we can look at the additional requirements. Because those practices have been taken from other security frameworks such as CSF, 853, FedRAMP, we have ways to kind of guess how they're going to be examined and how they'll be assessed. So we can kind of take that experience and at least give you a good idea as to whether or not you're meeting those practices. However, we can't, say that you're 100% guaranteed you're going to be certified, because we just don't know exactly what the assessment criteria is until DoD and the accreditation board officially release it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that clarification. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Ed and Eric, for just an outstanding panel presentation today on CMMC. We're hopeful that our graduates, our VIPs, our veterans that support the federal marketplace will be the first ones to get their CMMC and be more competitive and compliant because of it. And I really appreciate your insights. And I'd like to thank our participants for attending today's webinar, and to the SBA and Lockheed Martin for making today's webinar possible. I did want to point out also that it has been brought to my attention, and maybe you could confirm this on the panel, that every agency and prime will also have perhaps their own internal procedures and requirements to fulfill some of the CMMC. So be prepared for that. I know Lockheed Martin in particular are doing specific trainings for their supply chain. So be on the lookout for those nuances across primes and agencies. I would like to also ask that our participants take a moment to complete the very short survey that will be sent to you immediately following today's program. As always, your feedback is extremely important to us. Any other questions that come up that we didn't get to, we will send them out to all of the participants. And I want to thank you again, and we wish you continued success and good health in 2020. That concludes today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.